June 7, 1944. The evening after D-Day. Ardenne Abbey, a centuries-old Premonstratensian monastery on the outskirts of Caen, France, its ancient towers offering a commanding view of the surrounding Normandy countryside. SS Standardführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment within the 12th SS Panzer Division, had chosen the abbey as his regimental headquarters for exactly that reason. From its towers, he could watch the battlefield unfold across miles of hedgerow and open field as Canadian forces pushed inland from the beaches they'd stormed less than 24 hours earlier. Meyer was already a battle-hardened veteran by this point in the war, having fought on the Eastern Front and in earlier campaigns, known among his own men for aggressive tactics and an uncompromising command style that had earned him rapid promotion through the SS ranks. The 12th SS Panzer Division carried a name that told you almost everything you needed to know about who was fighting inside it. Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. Most of its soldiers had been recruited as teenagers, some barely out of the Hitler Youth organization itself, trained under officers who had come up through the fanaticism of the Waffen SS and instilled the same uncompromising ideology in boys young enough that many had never known adult life under anything but the Nazi regime. Allied intelligence reports from the weeks before D-Day had already flagged the division as a potentially dangerous, unknown, young, ideologically fanatical, and largely untested in the kind of prolonged, grinding combat Normandy was about to become. Facing them that day were soldiers of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusilier Regiment, part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, pushing toward Caen through villages named Authie and Buron in some of the fiercest fighting Canadian forces would face in the entire Normandy campaign. 27 Canadian soldiers were captured that day, taken prisoner in the chaos of close combat around those villages, and brought back toward the Abbey, toward Meyer's own headquarters, into the custody of a division whose soldiers, according to testimony that would surface over a year later, had been told explicitly by their commander not to take prisoners at all. SS Private Alfred Helzel, a young soldier under Meyer's command, would later tell Canadian investigators that Meyer had directed his men, before the fighting even began, to refuse quarter to any Allied troops they encountered. Helzel would waver on that claim under pressure, then confirm it again, but on the evening of June 7th, whatever order had or hadn't been given explicitly, the men holding those Canadian prisoners at Ardenne Abbey acted as though no other outcome had ever been considered. Private Stanley Dudka, one of the Canadian soldiers captured that day, later gave Canadian investigators a detailed account of what happened when his column arrived at the Abbey grounds. German military police demanded that 10 volunteers step forward from among the prisoners, offering no explanation for why or what would happen to them. When no one did, 10 men were simply selected at random, pulled out of the group without explanation, singled out one at a time in front of the rest of the column. One of them was Private Moss. Dudka watched them taken away, uncertain at the time whether he was witnessing a routine transfer or something far worse. That evening, 11 Canadians in total, soldiers from both the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, were led into the Abbey's walled garden and shot in the back of the head. One at a time, their bodies left where they fell among the Abbey's quiet, cultivated grounds, a space more accustomed to centuries of monastic prayer than to a killing carried out in the space of a single evening. If you want to hear the stories that show you exactly what happened when the youngest, most fanatical soldiers of the entire German army held Allied prisoners in their custody, subscribe. We find these accounts, we verify them, and we tell them exactly as they happened. The killing didn't stop that first night. The following day, June 8th, 7 more Canadian prisoners of war, all from the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, were brought individually to the same garden. They were interrogated first, questioned about troop positions and unit strength by officers who almost certainly already understood what would happen to the men once the questioning ended, then sent one by one to face the same fate as the men killed the evening before. Witnesses who survived the war and later testified to what they'd observed described something almost unbearable in its quiet dignity. Each of the 7 men, before being led away to be shot, shook hands with the companions who would follow him. A silent acknowledgement among men who understood exactly what was about to happen and had no way to stop it, no appeal to make. Nothing left to do but face it with whatever composure they could manage in the final minutes available to them. They were shot in the back of the head, the same method used the night before, their bodies added to those of the 11 men already lying in the garden. 18 Canadian soldiers now dead in a space smaller than most suburban backyards. More than a week later, on June 17th, the killing at Ardenne Abbey continued once more, a grim reminder that whatever had driven the initial burst of executions hadn't been a single moment of battlefield panic, but something closer to an ongoing policy. Lieutenant Fred Williams and Lance Corporal George Pollard, two more Canadian soldiers, were murdered at or near the Abbey grounds under circumstances investigators would spend months trying to fully reconstruct. The exact sequence of their capture and death never established with quite the same clarity as the mass killings of June 7th and 8th. In total, 20 Canadian soldiers were killed in or around the Abbey's garden over the span of 10 days in June of 1944. Across the broader Normandy campaign that followed D-Day, Canadian war crimes investigators would eventually conclude that as many as 156 Canadian prisoners of war had been executed by the 12th SS Panzer Division in scattered locations throughout the region, men taken aside in twos and threes across the Normandy countryside and shot. The killings at Ardenne Abbey, representing only the most concentrated and best documented cluster within a far larger pattern. Word of the missing men reached Canadian command in the days and weeks that followed, as units accounted for their casualties and found the numbers didn't add up. Soldiers listed as captured rather than killed in action, with no record of them ever reaching a proper German prisoner of war camp. It would take the better part of a year, working through the chaos of the war's final months and the immediate post-war occupation, before Canadian investigators began to understand the scale of what had actually happened to those missing men. The Canadian War Crimes Commission, led by Lieutenant Colonel Bruce MacDonald, opened a formal investigation once the fighting in Europe ended, working methodically through witness accounts, German documents, and the physical evidence eventually recovered from the Abbey grounds themselves, the very garden where the killings had taken place. Now a crime scene, investigators combed carefully for anything that might corroborate the accounts survivors were beginning to give. MacDonald understood almost immediately that the investigation would eventually center on one man above all others, Kurt Meyer, who had commanded the regiment operating out of the Abbey during the exact days the killings occurred, and who had gone on, later in the Normandy campaign, to take command of the entire 12th SS Panzer Division after his predecessor was killed in action, a rapid rise that made him, by the war's end, one of the youngest divisional commanders in the entire German army. If anyone bore responsibility for what had happened in that garden, every thread of the investigation pointed toward Meyer's own headquarters as the place to start looking. MacDonald's team spent months tracking down witnesses on both sides of the case, a task complicated by the fact that many of the German soldiers who had served under Meyer during those specific June days were scattered across POW camps, some killed later in the war, others reluctant to implicate a commander many still regarded with genuine loyalty despite everything that had happened. Citizens of Authie and Buron, the villages where the initial fighting and capture had taken place, gave testimony about what they had witnessed of the 12th SS conduct during the battle itself, adding a civilian perspective to a case built primarily around military witnesses. Surviving Canadian soldiers, including Private Dudka, provided detailed first-hand accounts of the selection process at the Abbey and the killings that followed, testimony that would later prove central to establishing exactly how the 10 men had been chosen and what happened to them afterward. And SS Private Helzel, despite recanting his testimony once under courtroom pressure, was eventually persuaded by investigators to reaffirm his original statement, that Meyer had ordered his men, before the fighting even began, that no prisoners were to be taken, a claim that, if it held up under cross-examination, would establish premeditation reaching well beyond any single officer's decision in the heat of a specific moment. On December 18, 1945, the Canadian military court convened at Aurich, Germany, to try Kurt Meyer for war crimes connected to the killings at Ardenne Abbey and the surrounding villages. 5 separate charges were laid against him: inciting his soldiers to refuse quarter to Allied troops, commanding the killing of 23 prisoners of war near Authie and Buron on June 7th, commanding the killing of 7 Canadian prisoners at the Abbey on June 8th, along with an alternative charge covering responsibility for that same killing, and additional counts tied to the broader pattern of executions his division had carried out. The prosecution built its case around the same threads MacDonald's team had spent months assembling: Dudka's account of the random selection at the Abbey gates, Helzel's testimony about the no-quarter order, and civilian witnesses who described the atmosphere of the 12th SS advance through Normandy. The court's verdict, delivered after weeks of testimony, was more complicated than a simple guilty or not guilty across the board. Meyer was acquitted of the 23 killings near Authie and Buran, the court finding insufficient direct evidence tying him personally to those specific deaths despite his command position over the units involved, a distinction the court drew carefully between overall command responsibility and direct evidence of a specific order for those particular killings. But on the charges connected directly to Ardenne Abbey itself, the killings that had taken place at his own regimental headquarters, in the garden he could see from his command post, involving prisoners brought directly into his own unit's custody, the court found him guilty. There was no plausible argument, the tribunal concluded, that a commander could remain unaware of 18 executions carried out over 2 consecutive nights within sight of his own headquarters. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. The sentence was never carried out. In the years that followed, amid the same shifting post-war political currents that would eventually see commutations in the Malmedy and Stalag Luft III cases as well, Meyer's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and then reduced further still as Cold War priorities increasingly shaped how occupying powers treated even convicted war criminals from the recently defeated German military. He would ultimately serve less than a decade before his release in 1954, a resolution that fueled lasting controversy and consternation in Canada for decades afterward, among veterans and families who felt the punishment had never matched the scale of what the court itself had found him responsible for. Meyer went on to live openly in West Germany after his release, writing memoirs and remaining a controversial figure within veteran circles until his death in 1961, a fate that stood in stark and uncomfortable contrast to the 20 men who never came home from the garden at his own headquarters. Meyer wasn't the only officer connected to the killings, and the record of what happened to the others is a mixed and uneven one. Wilhelm Siebken, another commander tied directly to specific murders, those of Canadian soldiers named Angel, Holness, and Baskerville, was tried separately, convicted, and hanged on January 20th, 1949, the only commander ultimately executed for his role in the broader pattern of killings connected to the 12th SS conduct in Normandy. Another officer implicated in the case, a man named Bremer, escaped prosecution entirely and relocated to Spain in the late 1940s, beyond the reach of any Canadian or Allied tribunal. A further officer, Milius, was recommended for indictment by Allied investigators, but was ultimately released without any charges being filed at all, an outcome that, like Meyer's commutation, left many of the families of the 20 men murdered at the Abbey with a sense that accountability had been only partially and unevenly delivered. Today, a memorial stands in the garden of Ardenne Abbey itself, the exact ground where the killings took place, inscribed with the names of the men who died there. 18 Canadian soldiers murdered in that garden on the nights of June 7th and 8th, and 2 more, Williams and Pollard, who died there or nearby on June 17th. The inscription reads simply that they are gone but not forgotten, a modest and understated marker for a crime that had taken the Canadian government the better part of 2 decades of legal proceedings, commutations, and unresolved cases to even partially answer for. The faces and names of all 20 men are displayed along the garden wall today, in the same quiet, cultivated space where German military police once pulled 10 Canadian soldiers at random from a line of prisoners and marched them toward a fate the rest of the group could only wait to share. The uneven accounting that followed the war left a complicated legacy for the families involved. Some received the closure of a conviction and, eventually, an execution for the men most directly responsible. Others watched an officer sentenced to death for ordering the murder of their sons and husbands walk free within a decade, living out the remainder of his life in relative peace, while the families of his victims marked anniversaries at gravesides and, eventually, at the memorial wall built into the same garden where the killings occurred. Canadian veterans organizations continued raising the case for decades after Meyer's release, arguing that the commutation had represented a failure of the justice the original tribunal had clearly intended to deliver. Even as officials pointed to the broader post-war political pressures that had shaped similar decisions in war crimes cases across occupied Europe throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s. If stories like this one matter to you, the ones that show what happened to men taken prisoner by the youngest and most fanatical soldiers this war produced, subscribe and stay with us. We'll keep finding these accounts, verifying them, and telling them exactly as they happened.